He had one rule after his wife died: never stop for anyone. Keep driving, keep your head down, keep Sophie fed and safe, and get home before the highways turned mean. He followed that rule for 5 years without breaking it once. Then came the storm. Then came the woman standing alone on the shoulder of the highway, soaking wet, shoulders squared against the wind like she was daring it to knock her down. And when Mason Cole finally looked at her face clearly, really looked, the coffee thermos slipped from his hand and hit the floorboard. Because she had Elena's eyes. If this story already has your heart beating faster, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The rain started somewhere around Milford Junction, which was about 40 miles and 2 construction detours outside the city, and by the time Mason Cole merged onto Interstate 9 heading south, it wasn't rain anymore. It was a full assault. The wipers on his pickup truck were 4 months past due for replacement, and every sweep left a smeared film across the windshield that the defrost couldn't quite fix. He leaned forward slightly in the driver's seat, both hands on the wheel, jaw set, watching the taillights of the car ahead bleed red through the water. It had been that kind of day, the kind where nothing went wrong in one single catastrophic way, but everything went slightly wrong in 8 different directions at once. The concrete pour at the Harmon Street site had been delayed 2 hours because a delivery driver had the wrong manifest. One of his foremen, Tully, had gotten into a shouting match with a city inspector over a drainage specification that Mason had already approved 3 weeks ago. And somewhere around 4 o'clock, a water line they were supposed to have rerouted had shown up right where they weren't supposed to be digging, which meant tomorrow was going to require a whole new conversation with the project engineer. He was tired in a way that went past his muscles. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. He glanced at the screen. Mrs. Pruitt, his neighbor, the woman who watched Sophie after school on the days he couldn't make pickup work. He answered through the truck's Bluetooth before it could buzz a second time. "Hey, Mrs. Pruitt." "Mason, honey, I just wanted to let you know Sophie's already had dinner. I made extra soup, so I sent some home with her. She's in your kitchen right now doing her reading assignment, and I think she's been on it for about 45 minutes, which, that child is something else, I'll tell you." He exhaled slowly. Some of the tension across his shoulders loosened, just a fraction. "Thank you. Really. She asked me why you don't have curtains in your living room yet. Tell her I'll get to it. She also asked if she could get a dog. Tell her absolutely not." Small laugh on the other end. "Drive safe, Mason. The weather's awful." "Yes, ma'am." He clicked off and settled back into the silence. The rain intensified, a sudden sheet of it hammering the roof of the cab like gravel from a dump truck, and he automatically reduced his speed by 10 miles per hour, watching the road markings disappear and reappear through the downpour. He thought about soup, about Sophie at the kitchen table doing her reading, probably with her feet up on the chair beside her, the way she always sat when she thought no one was looking. He thought about curtains. He'd been meaning to hang curtains in that living room for 3 years. Carla had picked them out, white with a thin linen weave, the kind that let light through without making the room feel exposed. They were still in the packaging on the top shelf of the linen closet. He'd put them there the week after the funeral, and every few months he'd open the closet for something else and see them there and think, "Not today," and then close the door. Sophie had never asked about them before. He didn't know if that was a good thing or not. The hazard lights came out of the rain like something he almost missed. 2 amber pulses strobing through the downpour on the right shoulder, maybe 300 feet ahead. His brain processed them as background information first, the same way you register a distant sound without turning your head. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw the shape of the vehicle, a large SUV, black or dark gray, pulled off the highway with its front hood raised slightly. He kept his speed and watched it approach in his headlights. There was a figure standing beside it. Not inside the vehicle, outside, in the full force of the storm, standing near the front driver's side wheel. Even from a distance, even through the smear of rain across his windshield, he could see the figure was a woman. Dark coat, no umbrella, completely still, like she'd already accepted that being soaked through was simply part of her evening now. He passed her. He watched her shrink in his rearview mirror until the rain swallowed her image. He drove another 200 feet. Then he said something under his breath that he wouldn't repeat in front of Sophie, and he pulled over onto the shoulder. He sat there for a moment with his hazards on, hands still on the wheel, asking himself what exactly he thought he was doing. It was late. The highway was dark. He was tired in a bone-deep way that made everything feel slightly slow, like he was moving through something thicker than air. There were plenty of people who would call for help and wait inside their car like a reasonable person. That's what he should have done. Kept moving, assumed she had a phone, assumed help was coming. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from behind the passenger seat, pulled his hood up, and got out of the truck. The rain hit him like someone had upended a bucket the second he stepped out. In the 10 seconds it took him to jog back along the shoulder to the stranded SUV, the back of his collar was already soaked through, and the rain was coming in cold enough that he could feel it in his teeth. The woman didn't flinch when he came around the front of the vehicle. She just turned and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between careful and exhausted, the look of someone who had already run through several scenarios in her head and was now accepting input from outside. She was in her early 30s, maybe 30, and even soaking wet in the storm-blasted dark. There was something immediately composed about her. The coat she was wearing was expensive. Not that Mason knew anything much about women's fashion, but he could tell quality from construction, and that coat had been made by someone who knew what they were doing. Her hair was plastered against her face and neck. She was holding her phone in one hand like she'd been mid-call. "Do you know what's wrong with it?" he asked, tilting his flashlight beam toward the engine compartment. She shook her head. The temperature gauge went into the red about 2 miles back, then the dashboard lit up and it pulled itself to the right. Did it actually pull itself, or did it just feel like it? She paused. Good question. Felt like it. He lifted the hood and shone the light in. The steam told him what he needed to know before anything else did. He could see the coolant reservoir cap, and even from a distance he could smell the faint sweetness of antifreeze burning off something hot. Overheated, he said. Probably a coolant line. Could be the radiator cap seal. Could be a hose gave out. He moved the beam carefully along the accessible parts of the engine block, looking for the source. Either way, you don't want to drive it right now. Anything you push through an overheated engine in this state, you're risking a cracked block. Is that as expensive as it sounds? More. She almost smiled at that. Not a real smile. More like the ghost of one. The involuntary twitch you get when something lands dryly in the middle of a bad situation. Mason found the source after another 30 seconds. A coolant hose running from the reservoir to the upper radiator had worked loose from its clamp, probably from vibration over time, and the steam was pouring off the top of the engine block in a thin, continuous stream. It wasn't catastrophic. It was the kind of thing that starts as a small problem and becomes a big one if you keep driving into it. He straightened up and looked at her. I've got a hose clamp set in my truck. Might be able to make a temporary fix, enough to get you to an exit, but the hose itself will need replacing properly. He paused. Do you want me to try? She looked at him for a beat. In the flashing amber of the hazards, her eyes were dark. Not unreadable, exactly, but the kind of eyes that were in the habit of not giving too much away. Yes, she said. Please. Okay, stay back from the engine, so it's still hot. He jogged back to his truck. It took him about 20 minutes in total, 12 to do the actual repair, and another 8 dealing with the rain making everything slippery and the clamp set being buried under his spare work gloves and a bungee cord collection that had been accumulating since about 2019. She didn't hover over him while he worked, which he appreciated. She stood back near the passenger side, out of the worst of the downpour where the vehicle gave her a sliver of shelter, and she was on her phone for part of it. He could hear her speaking in a low, very precise voice to someone, something about rescheduling and a car service. When he finally stood back up and wiped his hands on a rag from his toolbox, the engine temperature had come down and the hose was holding. It's not a permanent fix, he said. The hose is stressed and that clamp isn't the right size. You want to get it to a shop tomorrow. I understand. She had ended her call and was watching him now. Thank you. I genuinely wasn't sure what was going to happen out here. You were standing in the rain instead of sitting in the car, he said. It came out more like a question than he meant it to. She glanced at the SUV. The heat from the engine was coming through the firewall. It was uncomfortably warm inside. A beat. Also, my driver took the car service vehicle to pick up my assistant's mother from the airport earlier, and he's 40 minutes away, so I was calculating whether the rain or the heat was the worse option. Mason looked at her. Your driver, he said. Yes. So you were just standing out here by yourself? I had my phone. In a storm, on a highway, in the dark. I'm aware of where I was, she said, and there was a note in her voice that wasn't quite sharp, more like a quiet correction, the way a person speaks when they're used to people underestimating their ability to handle things. He nodded. Sorry, I just meant that was a bad situation. It was. She paused, and something in her posture shifted, a fraction of the composure letting go. It was a very bad situation, and I appreciate you stopping. Most people didn't. Yeah. He looked back at the highway, the headlights sweeping past without slowing. People get cautious. You didn't. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't offer one. She extended her hand. Her grip was firm and direct, no hesitation in it. Victoria Sinclair. He shook it. Mason Cole. The roadside assistance unit was still 35 minutes out. Not because Victoria hadn't called, but because the storm had apparently produced 4 other incidents on the same stretch of highway in the past hour, and the dispatch was running a prioritized queue. Mason had started back toward his truck twice. Both times, something had stopped him. Once because Victoria's temporary repair had made a noise he didn't like, and he'd wanted to check it again, and the second time because she'd asked, very matter-of-factly, whether he wanted to wait in the SUV where at least it was dry. It wasn't a warm invitation. It was pragmatic. She had a vehicle. It had seats. It was not raining inside it. The logic was straightforward. He climbed into the passenger side. The interior of the SUV was something else. Soft leather, the kind of quiet that expensive acoustic insulation creates. A faint smell of something understated and probably costly. Mason sat in it and felt the pronounced contrast to his own truck, which smelled like sawdust and the vanilla air freshener Sophie had installed in October without asking. Victoria was in the driver's seat, her wet coat draped over the back. Without the rain pounding on her and the storm backdrop, she was different to look at. Not softer, exactly. But the emergency context stripped away, she looked like someone who was genuinely very tired. Not just tonight tired, the deeper kind. What kind of construction do you do? She asked. He glanced at her. Commercial, mostly. Some infrastructure. We're currently on a mixed-use development project in the Milford district. Retail on the lower floors. Residential on 4 through 12. Harmon Street? He looked at her again, more directly this time. You know it? My company has 3 buildings in that district. We've been watching the Harmon Street development for a while. A pause. Not competitively, the residential element isn't our primary sector, but it's a significant project. It is, he said. What does your company do? Real estate development, asset management, some retail infrastructure. She said it the way people say things they've described 10,000 times. Not bored, exactly, but practiced. Sinclair Group. He processed that for a second. You're the CEO, he said. Yes. He'd heard the name. Anyone in the construction and development sector in this city had heard the name. Sinclair Group was one of the largest private real estate entities on the eastern seaboard. The name appeared on buildings, on construction bids, on the financial pages of the business section that he occasionally skimmed when something relevant to his industry came up. He looked at the woman in the driver's seat, soaking wet hair drying in pieces against her neck, mascara slightly smudged beneath her left eye from the rain, telling him very calmly that she ran a billion-dollar enterprise. That's a significant job, he said. That's one word for it. What would you call it? She thought for a moment, not performing the pause, actually thinking. Consuming, she said. I'd call it consuming. Mason nodded slowly. What does that mean for the rest of your life? He asked. He wasn't sure why he asked it. It came out more directly than he intended, and he felt the slight awkwardness of it. But she didn't look bothered. It means the rest of my life mostly exists in calendar slots. She looked at the rain against the windshield. I have a very organized assistant who guards my schedule with genuine ferocity. I have a car and a driver. I have a building with a penthouse on the 32nd floor. She paused. And tonight, I was standing alone on a highway in a storm because I told the driver I was fine to come home in the company SUV by myself, which was apparently optimistic. Mason almost laughed. What about family? He asked. You said a driver. Is there someone waiting at home or— My mother, she said. She's in the city. We talk most days. Something moved through her expression, brief and controlled. She raised me by herself, working 2 jobs when I was young, then 1 job when her business started taking off. She's the reason I am what I am, in most of the ways that matter. What does she do now? She retired 4 years ago. She consults sometimes. Mostly she reads and travels and pretends she's not still checking her old industry contacts every week. A faint smile now, more real than the earlier one, something genuine in it. She's not very good at slowing down. I may have inherited that particular problem. Mason said nothing for a moment. What's her name? He asked. It was small talk, background conversation between 2 strangers waiting for a tow, the kind of exchange you have 100 times in a life and forget by the following Thursday. Victoria turned her head and looked at him. Elena, she said. Elena Brooks. The name hit him the way nothing had hit him in a very long time. Not loudly. That was the strange thing about it. There was no sudden surge of dramatic feeling, no movie moment where the music swells and everything goes slow. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. It was like hearing a sound from a room you thought was empty. Elena Brooks. He knew exactly who Elena Brooks was. He didn't need to search his memory for her or reassemble her from scattered details. She was there, immediate and whole, the way people are when they've left marks deep enough that time doesn't cover them. It just buries them under other things. He had been 21 when he met her. She had been 20, working the counter at a print shop 3 blocks from the community college he'd been enrolled at before the money ran out. He'd gone in to print a set of architectural drawings for a class project, and had ended up staying 40 minutes past when the drawings were finished, talking to a woman who was reading Steinbeck on her break and had opinions about it that she delivered without apology. They had been together for 2 years. Not perfect years. They were young and broke and stubborn, and their families did not make things easy. But the kind of years that leave a permanent watermark on a person, the kind that become the measuring line. Then she was gone. One conversation in a parking lot behind a grocery store, her face set in a way he'd never seen it before, and she'd told him she was leaving, that it wasn't working, that they wanted different things. He had stood in that parking lot for a long time after her car pulled away, and then he had gone home and called his friend Derek, and they had sat on Derek's back porch until 2 a.m. without saying very much. He had never gotten a real explanation. He had asked more than once in more than one way. And the closest she came to answering was, "Sometimes love isn't enough, Mason, and I need you to understand that without me explaining every piece of it." He hadn't understood. He still didn't. He had moved on, eventually, the way people move on when they don't have another option. He'd met Carla at a job site 3 years later. She was the project coordinator, organized and direct and funny in a way that snuck up on you. And what began as a functional professional relationship had transformed slowly into something he hadn't been looking for, but had needed badly. They married at 27. Sophie came along at 28. And when Carla's heart gave out without warning at the age of 31, a congenital defect neither of them knew existed. Mason had stood at her grave and felt the particular brutal unfairness of a man who had already lost one love and was now losing another. He had never looked for Elena after Carla died. It hadn't felt like something he was allowed to do. And also, there had been Sophie, who was 3 years old and terrified and needed her father to stay standing. Now he was sitting in a stranded SUV on a flooded highway, soaking wet, and the woman across from him had just told him her mother's name, Elena Brooks. Victoria was watching him. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out flat, not controlled, just empty, the kind of voice that happens when the rest of your brain is occupied with something else. "Sorry, He stopped. "What?" He turned and looked at her properly. Now that he was looking, really looking, with the name in his ears and the timeline assembling itself in the back of his mind, the resemblance was so complete that it was almost disorienting. Victoria was taller than he remembered Elena being, and her bearing was different, the posture of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than print shop counters. But the structure of her face, the particular shape of her eyes, the way they held attention, the small unconscious tilt of her head when she was thinking. His daughter Sophie did the same thing with her head. He'd never thought much about where it came from, but now. How old are you? He asked. She blinked, not offended, genuinely surprised by the question, which she probably hadn't expected following a sustained silence on his part. 30, she said. Why? The math was right. The math was almost exactly right, depending on certain things he didn't know for certain. Nothing, he said. I'm sorry. I was somewhere else for a second. He needed to not say anything else. Not tonight. Not in this SUV. Not without knowing anything more than a name and a timeline and a resemblance that could very easily be coincidence. People looked like other people. Common features existed in the world. Elena Brooks was a woman he'd been in love with at 21, and that was over a decade ago, and coincidences happened. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs and looked at the rain against the windshield. You said your mother raised you alone, he said, and he was trying to keep his voice neutral and knew he wasn't fully succeeding. Yes. No father in the picture. There was a pause. No, Victoria said carefully. Not in my life. My mother didn't talk about that much. I learned not to push it. A beat. Is there a reason you're asking? He shook his head. No, he said. No reason. The lie sat between them in the warm air of the SUV, and he was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound you're pretending not to hear. The roadside assistance truck arrived at 9:47 p.m. Mason helped the technician assess the repair he'd already made, answered a few questions about the hose and the clamp, and confirmed that the vehicle was stable enough to drive to a shop the following morning. The whole exchange took about 15 minutes. When it was done, the technician climbed back into his truck and left, and Mason and Victoria were standing beside the SUV again, the rain lighter now, reduced from its earlier ferocity to a steady, quiet drip. You should get home, she said. You've already given up a significant portion of your evening. It's fine. You have a daughter waiting. He looked at her. Mrs. Pruitt would have texted me. Still. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, and he noticed, without meaning to, that her hands were slightly unsteady now that the adrenaline of the evening had let go, the fine tremor of someone who'd been holding composure tight for hours. She produced a business card, matte black with silver type, and held it out to him. I want to compensate you for your time, and the parts. He shook his head. I used a clamp from my own kit. Cost me about $4. Mason. It's fine, he said. She kept holding the card out. He took it, not because he wanted the compensation, he didn't, but because not taking it had started to feel like a different kind of conversation, and he didn't have the capacity for that tonight. He looked at the card. Victoria Sinclair, Chief Executive Officer, Sinclair Group. A phone number, an email, the corporate address downtown. I should probably have your number in return, she said, in case the shop has questions about what you did to the hose. It was practical and slightly transparent, and he could tell she knew it was both. He recited his number. She typed it into her phone. Then she looked at him, and for just a moment the practiced composure was entirely absent from her face. She looked, in that moment, like someone standing at the edge of something they couldn't name. I feel like... She stopped herself. What? She shook her head slightly. Nothing. It's nothing. Drive safely, Mason. He walked back to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a full 30 seconds before starting the engine, the business card sitting on the seat beside him, rain collecting on the windshield in overlapping rivers. Victoria Sinclair, 30 years old. Mother named Elena Brooks. No father. He started the truck. He pulled onto the highway. And for the first 40 miles of the drive home, he didn't think about concrete pours or drainage specifications or curtains in the linen closet. Sophie was asleep when he got home. Mrs. Pruitt had gone home 2 hours earlier. She always left a note on the kitchen counter with the day's report, written in careful cursive on the backs of old envelopes, cataloging whatever had happened in the hours between school pickup and Mason's return. Tonight's note. Dinner, chicken soup, and half a grilled cheese. Homework, reading, finished. Mood, chatty. She asked about curtains again. He stood in the kitchen and read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept all the others. He went down the hall and opened Sophie's door quietly. She was curled on her side, one arm around the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2, her breathing the slow, easy rhythm of deep sleep. Her hair was fanned out across the pillow in the chaotic way it always arranged itself, and one sock was half off her foot where she must have been kicking at it before she fell asleep. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about what it would mean if the math was right. He thought about Elena standing in a parking lot 12 years ago and saying, "I need you to understand without me explaining every piece of it." He thought about Victoria Sinclair standing alone on a highway in the rain, her hands unsteady in the moment after she'd stopped holding herself so carefully together. And he thought about the way she had almost said something at the end, had started a sentence she'd then decided not to finish. "I feel like..." He turned off the hall light and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. In the days that followed, he found himself returning to the memory of that night with an uncomfortable regularity, not with nostalgia exactly, which wasn't something he allowed himself much of anymore, but with the focused attention of a man trying to determine whether what he'd seen was real, or whether exhaustion and the rain and the strange trick of resemblance had assembled something from nothing. He Googled Victoria Sinclair Group on his lunch break the following Thursday, sitting in his truck outside the Harmon Street site with a gas station sandwich he hadn't started eating yet. The results were extensive. She had taken over the company at 26, following the death of a mentor and former partner named Gerald Whitfield, who had apparently discovered her at 22 while she was completing her MBA and brought her in as a junior analyst. There were profile pieces in 3 business publications, a Forbes interview from 18 months ago, and a photograph from a conference she'd spoken at that showed her at a podium in front of a room full of people who were all paying close attention. She looked exactly like the woman he'd sat in the SU-5 with. She looked exactly like a version of someone he'd loved at 21. He closed the browser. He stared at the construction site through the windshield for a while. Then he picked up the business card from the seat beside him. He had moved it from the truck seat to the dash to the glove box and then back to the seat, which told him something about where his head was, and he set it on the dashboard and looked at it. The phone buzzed, unknown number, but local area code. He answered. "Mason Cole." "It's Victoria Sinclair." A brief pause. "I wanted to check that the SUV story had a satisfying ending. The shop confirmed the hose was the issue. They replaced it this morning and found the clamp you used rather charming, apparently." He heard himself make a sound that was almost a laugh. Charming's a word. They said it was a creative solution. $4 clamp doing $800 work. Something like that? Another pause, and in it he could feel the real reason for the call existing just outside the professional framing she'd put around it. "I also wanted to thank you again, properly, without rain and emergency context distorting the communication. You thanked me at the time." "I know. I wanted to do it again." Something shifted in her voice, the boardroom polish softening slightly at the edges. "My driver felt terrible, by the way. He's been apologizing since yesterday." "Tell him it wasn't his fault." "I did. He apologized for it not being his fault." Mason looked out through the windshield at the skeleton of the Harmon Street building. "How are you doing?" he asked, which was not what he'd intended to say, and he knew it. There was a pause. "I'm fine," she said. And then, after another beat, in a slightly different register, "I've been thinking about something you asked me." "What did I ask?" "About my father." A pause. "Or lack of one." Her voice was measured, the careful intonation of someone saying something they've chosen very deliberately to say. "You asked about it specifically, and then you said there was no reason, which is the kind of thing people say when there's a reason." He didn't answer immediately. "Victoria, you don't have to explain anything," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for an explanation. I noticed, and I wanted you to know I noticed, because I think pretending otherwise would be strange." Mason pinched the bridge of his nose. "There's someone I used to know," he said. "A long time ago. Your mother's name surprised me." Silence on the other end. "How long ago?" she asked finally. 12 years? More silence. "I see," she said. And in the careful neutrality of those 2 words, he could hear 100 questions she wasn't asking, arranged in a queue she'd built the moment he spoke. "I don't want to make assumptions," he said. "And I don't want to... I could be wrong about this entire thing. The name could be a coincidence." "Yes," she said. "It could." Neither of them said what the other option was. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The night on the highway, when you looked at me, before the repair, you stopped moving for a second. He remembered. The flashlight beam. Her face in the amber of the hazards. I noticed that, she said. Yeah. What did you see? He exhaled slowly, one long breath. Someone I thought I'd stopped looking for, he said. The silence that followed was long enough that he wondered for a moment if the call had dropped. Then she said very quietly, I think we need to talk, not on the phone. Yeah, he said. I think we do. The coffee shop Victoria had suggested was on Clement Street, 2 blocks west of the financial district, not the kind of place where people from her world usually met, which Mason suspected was the point. It was narrow and slightly worn at the edges, the kind of establishment that had survived 3 rounds of neighborhood gentrification by being too stubborn and too good to be displaced. The chairs didn't match. The menu was written on a chalkboard that hadn't been fully erased in what looked like several years. It smelled like roasted beans and old wood and something baked that morning. Mason arrived 7 minutes early and ordered a black coffee he didn't particularly want, and sat at a corner table where he could see both the door and the street window. Old habit. Not a paranoid one, just the orientation of a man who spent his days on job sites where you learned quickly to always know what was behind you and what was coming toward you. He was on his second careful sip when Victoria walked in. She was dressed differently than the night on the highway. Not corporate, not the emergency weather version of herself either. Dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, her hair down. She looked younger and also more unguarded, which probably wasn't accidental. She scanned the room once, found him immediately, and crossed toward his table with the same contained, purposeful walk he remembered from the SUV. She sat down across from him without the small social ceremony most people deploy. No exaggerated looking around, no comments about the weather or the traffic. She just sat down, put her phone face down on the table, and looked at him. Thank you for coming, she said. You picked the place, he said. I was already downtown. A server appeared, and Victoria ordered tea without looking at the menu, and then the server left and they were alone again with the noise of the coffee shop around them and the question neither of them had said out loud yet sitting between them like something fragile. I called my mother last night, Victoria said. Mason set his cup down. I didn't tell her why, she continued. I just called to talk. We do that. It wasn't unusual. She paused. But I was listening for things I don't normally listen for. The way she talks about the past. What she says and what she doesn't say. And she doesn't say much, Victoria said, about before me. She talks about her mother, her aunts, places she lived. She talks about her work. She talks about me, my childhood, decisions she made. She looked at her hands flat on the table. But there's a gap. A specific window of time, early in her 20s, that she's always talked around. I noticed it when I was a teenager. I asked once, directly, and she said some things are private, not because they're shameful, but because they're still tender. She looked up. I accepted that. I'm not sure I should have. Mason was quiet for a moment. Victoria, he said, I want to be careful here, because what I'm thinking, if I'm wrong, I've created something that can't easily be undismantled. And if I'm right, he stopped. If you're right, she said, then you've said out loud something that's been true for 30 years, whether we say it or not. He looked at her. In the daylight of the coffee shop, without the emergency context and the rain and the hazard lights, the resemblance was even more precise than he'd been willing to fully acknowledge to himself. The particular dark quality of her eyes, the structure of her face in profile when she turned slightly to watch a couple walk past the window. The set of her jaw when she was choosing her words carefully. He had a photograph of Elena on his phone, not because he'd kept it deliberately, but because it was embedded in an old group photograph from Derek's birthday party in 2011, and it had survived every phone upgrade by being part of a folder he never sorted. He had looked at it 3 times in the past week, and each time he'd closed the app quickly afterward, as though keeping it open constituted something he hadn't given himself permission for. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to understand I'm not asking to be invasive. I'm asking because the alternative is pretending this isn't the thing that's sitting in the middle of this table. Ask, she said. Do you know anything about your father? Any detail at all? Name, age, what he did, where he was from. Victoria was still for a long moment. She told me once, she said slowly, when I was about 15 and asking very directly and refusing to be redirected, that my father was someone she'd loved. Not someone who'd done something wrong, not someone who was gone because of cruelty or indifference. She said they were young, and the timing was bad, and the circumstances were harder than they could carry at that age, and that leaving the situation, leaving him, was the hardest decision she ever made. Mason's chest did something he didn't have a word for. She said something else, Victoria continued. Her voice was steady, but he could see the effort in it, the careful management of a person who dealt in precision. She said, "He was the most decent man I ever met at 20 years old, and I hope life treated him well, because he deserved better than what I gave him." The coffee shop noise continued around them. The hiss of the espresso machine, someone laughing at a table near the window, a woman on her phone by the door. All of it normal and entirely irrelevant. Mason picked up his coffee cup and then put it back down without drinking from it. "I was 21 when I met Elena," he said. "She was 20. We were together for 2 years, and then she left, and she didn't give me a full explanation, and I spent a long time being angry about that, and then a longer time just carrying it." He paused. "I never stopped thinking she left because something I did drove her off. That's what you think when someone goes without fully explaining. You assume it was something you were." Victoria said nothing. "If the timeline is what I think it might be," he said carefully, "then she left knowing something I didn't know, and that changes the calculation on why she went." The silence between them was the kind that has weight to it. "You think she was pregnant?" Victoria said. "Not a question. I think it's possible." "And you think that's why she left?" "I think," he said, "that at 20 years old, in the circumstances we were in, no money, families that were already applying pressure, a relationship that was already straining under all of it, she might have made a decision about what telling me would do to both of us, and made it without me." Victoria looked at the table. "That would make her," she said slowly, "either cowardly or incredibly self-sacrificing, and I genuinely don't know which one it is. Maybe both." "Yeah," Mason said. "Me neither." They sat with that for a while. "What do you want to do?" she asked eventually. He exhaled. "I don't know. I've been asking myself that for a week." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habitual gesture, something to do with his hands while his brain was working. "What do you want to do?" She looked at him directly. "I want to know the truth. Whatever it is. I've wanted to know the truth about this for most of my adult life, and I've been careful not to push my mother on it because I could see it was something that still hurt her. But I'm 30 years old and—" She stopped. "And what?" "And I'm sitting in a coffee shop across from a man who repaired my car in a rainstorm and who might be my father, and the situation has rather made the decision for me." The word father landed differently than any other word in the conversation. It changed the air quality. Mason felt it in his sternum, not painfully, but with a weight that he wasn't sure what to do with yet. "We shouldn't go to Elena with assumptions," he said. "We need to go with a question. One question, directly and respectfully asked. And whatever she says, that's what we deal with." Victoria nodded. "She's in the city," she said. "She lives in Ardmore Heights, 20 minutes from here." "I know," he said. Then he caught himself. "I mean, I don't know where she lives. I meant I know the neighborhood." Victoria looked at him with something in her expression he couldn't fully categorize. Not quite sympathy, not quite recognition, something in between. "I'll call her," she said. "Not today. I need to think about how to say it." She paused. "And I think you should be there. When I talk to her, I don't think I should do this by myself." "You sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But I don't think it matters." He nodded. She picked up her tea and finally drank some of it, and for a moment they sat in something that wasn't quite comfortable but was at least shared. Two people trying to figure out what territory they'd wandered into and how to move through it without doing more damage than the truth already would. "Can I ask you something else?" Victoria said. "Yeah. Your daughter, Sophie." She'd remembered the name from the highway conversation. "How old is she?" 8. "What's she like?" The question surprised him a little, not unwelcomely. He thought about it genuinely, the way you do when someone asks about your kid and you're actually trying to give them an accurate picture rather than just the headline version. She's stubborn, he said. Smart in a way she doesn't always show people, because she's also watching and evaluating before she decides to let you see it. She reads constantly. She has very firm opinions about food. She'll eat almost anything, but she will not eat onions, and she can detect them even when they're caramelized down to practically invisible, which I find both impressive and inconvenient. He paused. She laughs like her mother did, fully, like something physical. And she misses her mom in this quiet way that she mostly keeps to herself. She doesn't talk about it directly very often. I think she worries it'll make me sad. Does it? Every time, he said simply. Victoria set her cup down. She sounds like someone I'd like to know, she said. Yeah, Mason said. She'd probably like you too. She's been asking for a dog for 6 months. She'd probably feel like anyone who listened to that argument deserved respect. Victoria almost laughed. A real one, brief and surprised. It was the first genuinely easy moment either of them had managed in the past 40 minutes, and they both seemed to notice it at the same time. And then they both looked away. The server came by and refilled Mason's coffee without being asked, which was the kind of small, efficient kindness that he appreciated more than he used to. He thanked her. She smiled and moved on. I have a meeting at 2, Victoria said, not looking at her phone, which told him she was tracking time internally. I need to leave in about 20 minutes. That's fine. I'll call you when I've figured out what to say to her. She paused. It might take a few days. I don't want to do it wrong. I know. Take whatever time you need. She picked up her phone from the table and stood, and then paused with that particular quality of someone who has something left to say and is deciding whether to say it. Mason. He looked up. I want to be clear that I'm not looking for something dramatic. I'm not looking for a revelation that fixes anything or explains everything. I'm 30 years old and I have a life and a company and a mother I love, and whatever the truth is, it doesn't undo any of that. She met his eyes steadily. But I think you have a right to know, and I think I do too. And whatever comes after that, we figure it out like adults. He held her gaze. That's fair, he said. She nodded once and left. He sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, drinking the coffee he'd had refilled, watching the street through the window. The city moved past in its usual purposeful rush, people who knew exactly where they were going and why, and he sat still in the middle of it trying to hold the shape of what the past week had become. He thought about Elena's voice in a parking lot 12 years ago. I need you to understand without me explaining every piece of it. He thought about what understanding might cost now that it was finally available. He didn't have an answer. He just paid the check and went back to work. The call came on a Tuesday, 8 days later. He was on the Harmon Street site when his phone buzzed, standing on the 5th floor with a hard hat and a set of revised drawings that the structural engineer had sent over that morning, which had required about 3 hours of his morning to reconcile with what was already built. He was in the middle of explaining something to Tully about load-bearing specifications when the screen showed Victoria's name. He held up a finger to Tully and stepped back from the noise. Hey, he said. She'll see you Thursday afternoon. Victoria's voice was even, but there was something compressed in it, the way a voice sounds when it's carrying more than the words. At her house. 4 o'clock. She knows you're coming. He stood very still against the exposed concrete of the 5th floor. You told her. I told her I'd met someone who knew her from a long time ago and that we both needed to talk to her. A brief pause. She didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then she said okay. Then she said she'd make coffee. How did she sound? The pause was longer this time. Scared, Victoria said. She sounded scared. And I've never heard my mother sound scared before. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. I'll text you the address, Victoria said. And Mason, I'll be there too. I'm not leaving her alone with this. With you, I mean. She caught herself. That came out wrong. I didn't mean... I know what you meant, he said. I wouldn't expect anything else. After the call ended, he stood on the exposed 5th floor of the Harmon Street building for another few minutes, looking out across the city skyline through the open floor framework. The sky was pale and high and cold, the kind of November sky that gives no warmth even when the sun is full in it. He thought about a 20-year-old woman making a decision alone. He thought about what alone must have looked like for her at that age, in those circumstances. He had spent 12 years being quietly angry at Elena for leaving without explanation, and somewhere in the past 8 days that anger had shifted its shape into something else, something more complicated and harder to carry in a clean way. Tully appeared at his shoulder. "You good, boss?" "Yeah," Mason said. "Let's go over those load specs again." Thursday arrived the way days do when you've been dreading and wanting them simultaneously. Too quickly and somehow not quickly enough. Mason picked Sophie up from school at normal time, dropped her at Mrs. Pruitt's with the explanation that he had a work meeting running late, which felt like the least harmful version of the truth he could offer an 8-year-old, and then drove across the city to Ardmore Heights with the address on his phone mount and the radio off. The neighborhood was quiet and well kept, the kind of residential block where people planted things and tended them. Elena's house was a craftsman-style property with a deep front porch and 2 large oaks in the yard that were still holding their last leaves in the November cold. Victoria's car was already in the driveway. He sat in his truck for a moment. He had rehearsed this. He'd been rehearsing it for 3 days in spare moments, in the shower, in the truck on the way to the site, lying awake at 11 at night when the house was quiet and his brain refused to turn off. He'd assembled and disassembled what he wanted to say, tried to find the tone that was honest without being an accusation, direct without being an assault. Every version he'd rehearsed dissolved when he got out of the truck and walked up the porch steps. Victoria opened the door before he knocked. She was pale in a way she hadn't been in the coffee shop, the particular pallor of someone who'd been up the previous night and was running on something other than sleep. "She's in the kitchen," she said quietly. He stepped inside. The house was warm and ordered. Books on every flat surface that wasn't functionally occupied, framed prints on the walls, not expensive art, just images that meant something to someone. A reading chair by the front window with a lamp and a folded blanket beside it. The house of a person who lived in it rather than decorated it. He followed Victoria through to the kitchen. Elena was standing at the counter with her back to them when they walked in. She was facing the window over the sink, one hand on the countertop, and when she heard them, she turned. 12 years. She was different. 42 now, where she'd been 30 when he'd last seen her, and that was visible in the way it always is, not as damage, but as accumulation. The lines at the corners of her eyes, the gray that had come in at her temples, and which she hadn't colored out, the weight of someone who had lived a full, complicated life between then and now, and showed it without apology. But she was immediately, unmistakably Elena. She looked at him the way someone looks when they've been bracing for a thing, and it still manages to be harder than they prepared for. "Mason," she said. "Elena," he said. They stood there for a moment with Victoria slightly behind him and the kitchen between them and 12 years of accumulated silence on both sides. "You should sit down," Elena said finally. "Both of you. I made coffee." He pulled out a chair and sat. Victoria sat beside him. Elena poured 3 cups with hands that were not entirely steady and brought them to the table and then sat across from them both. And there was something almost unbearably ordinary about it. 3 adults at a kitchen table in the late afternoon with coffee cups in front of them. "I've been thinking about this conversation for 30 years, Elena said. Her voice was quiet and level, and he could hear the effort in the levelness. "And I still don't have a speech prepared, which probably says something about what I was hoping would happen, on some level, which is not something I'm proud of." "You don't need a speech," Victoria said. Her voice was gentle but tight. "You just need to tell the truth." Elena looked at her daughter, and then she looked at Mason. And in the way she looked at him, the combination of guilt and grief and something that might have been relief and something else that had no clean name, he understood that the question he'd been carrying for the past week wasn't actually a question anymore. "You were pregnant when you left," he said. Not an accusation, just the thing that needed to be said. Elena's throat moved. "Yes," she said. The words sat on the table between all 3 of them. Victoria made a small sound that wasn't quite a word, a breath leaving her body in a specific way. "Why?" Mason asked. Still quiet, still steady. He was using everything he had to stay steady, and he could feel it costing him. "Because I was 20 years old and terrified," Elena said. "Because your family was already threatening to cut you off if you didn't end the relationship, and mine were telling me I was ruining both our lives, and we were fighting every week about money and the future and things we didn't have answers to. She pressed her hands flat against the table, and I stood there with a test in my hand thinking that if I told you, you would stay. That's what you would have done. You would have stayed, and you would have built something on top of a foundation that was already cracking, and you would have quietly resented it by 30, and I would have quietly resented the resentment, and we would have made something broken together. You don't know that, Mason said. No, she said. I don't, you're right, I don't know that. She looked at him directly. But I was 20, and that was the calculation I made. And I was wrong, maybe, probably. But I was 20 and I made it, and then I had to live with it. Victoria's voice, when she spoke, was measured in the way that takes significant work. You could have told me, at some point, when I was older, when I was asking. I know, Elena said. I asked you directly at 15, and again at 19. And you said, I know what I said. Elena's voice cracked slightly at the seam. Victoria, I know. I have replayed those conversations more times than I can count. And I don't have an answer that will make it make sense, because the longer I kept it, the harder it became to find a way in. And I kept thinking, when you're older, when things are more settled, when the timing is… She stopped. There is no right timing for a thing like this. That's what I finally understood about 5 years ago. And by then I had kept it so long that saying it felt like it would break something I was terrified to break. Mason looked at his coffee cup. He was sorting through a complicated arrangement of feelings. The old anger that had been sitting quietly under everything for a decade, now rising and then settling back as something more like grief when he looked at the woman across from him, who was not the person he'd built the anger toward in his imagination. The person across from him was a woman who had made a decision at 20 that she'd been carrying ever since. And whatever she deserved for it, she had clearly not been spared the weight of it. Elena, he said. She looked at him. Did you, after you left, did you want to contact me at any point? Her eyes filled. She held them steady through what looked like effort. I almost did, she said. When I found out my mother was sick, I almost called. When Victoria started walking, I almost sent a photograph. She paused. And when Carla died, I saw the notice. A mutual friend forwarded it to me, and I picked up the phone and put it back down probably 6 times in a week, because what would I have said? And what would it have done to you and Sophie? Carla died? Victoria said. She looked at Mason. Your wife, 5 years ago, he said. Sophie was 3. Victoria absorbed that quietly. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of one hand in a quick, unelegant gesture. The kitchen was very quiet except for the small sounds of the house, the heat system ticking, something outside, the distant minor percussion of a neighborhood afternoon. I'm not asking you to fix anything, Mason said finally, slowly. I'm 32 years old and I'm not looking for someone to blame for the past. I've got enough going on without building a case. He looked up. But I have a daughter who lost her mother, and she has been missing something specific in her life since she was 3 years old. And I've been going through this by myself, and… He stopped, restarted. I don't know what any of this becomes, but I need to know if we're capable of being honest with each other now, because that's the only ground anything can actually stand on. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at her mother with an expression that held too many things at once to name cleanly. Hurt and love and anger and the complicated grace of a person who has absorbed a blow and is deciding whether to stand back up. Yeah, Victoria said quietly. That's what I need too. Elena pressed her hands together. I can do that, she said. I can try. It wasn't a resolution, it wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation, and it wasn't any of the clean words people put on moments like this to make them manageable. It was 3 imperfect people sitting in a kitchen in November, trying to be honest after a very long time of not being, and discovering that honesty doesn't make things easier. It just makes them real. Mason drove home in the dark with the radio still off, and when he got to Mrs. Pruitt's to collect Sophie, she ran at him the moment the door opened and grabbed him around the waist with both arms and said, Dad, Mrs. Pruitt let me watch 2 episodes of the nature documentary, and there was a part with squid that was actually terrifying but also really good. Can we get the streaming plan that has more of those? He held on to her for a moment longer than she expected.
"Yeah," he said. "We can probably do that." She pulled back and looked at his face with the focused attention of a child who reads people well and knows when something is different. "Are you okay?" she asked. He looked at his daughter, her clear eyes, her serious expression, the stuffed elephant peeking out of her backpack zipper where she'd apparently tried to bring it to Mrs. Pruitt's and mostly concealed it. "I had a big day," he said honestly, "but I'm okay."
She considered this for a moment. "Did you eat anything?" "Not really." "Dad." She took his hand and started walking toward the truck with the matter-of-fact authority of an 8-year-old who had decided the situation required her management. "We're getting something on the way home. You can't not eat. That's not good for your brain." He followed her. He thought about a kitchen table in Ardmore Heights and 3 cups of coffee and the specific heaviness of a truth that had waited 30 years to land. And then he thought about Sophie pulling open the truck door and climbing up into the passenger seat and saying, "I was thinking tacos. What do you think?" And he thought that sometimes the thing that keeps you standing is not the big complicated truth, but the small clear one right in front of you. "Tacos," he said. "Yeah, tacos sounds good." The DNA test was Victoria's idea, and she raised it at the end of the second meeting. A week after the kitchen table, same house, this time with better coffee and slightly less terror in the room, though not much. "I think we need to do it," she said. She was sitting in Elena's reading chair by the front window, legs crossed, her hands around her cup. "Not because I doubt what we all know at this point, but because I don't want there to ever be a version of this where someone, me, Mason, anyone, has a reason to question the foundation of it." Mason was on the couch. Elena was in the armchair across from him. The lamp was on because the afternoon had gone gray early, the way November afternoons do. "You mean for legal reasons," Elena said carefully. "I mean for all reasons," Victoria said. "Legal ones eventually, possibly, but mainly because if we're going to build anything from here, any kind of relationship, any kind of honesty, I want it standing on something solid." Mason looked at his hands. He'd been thinking about this already, in the quiet of his own head, turning it over in the way he turned over structural problems on a job site. The question of what the foundation actually needed to hold the weight you were planning to put on it. Victoria was right. They all knew what the truth was, sitting in that room. But knowing and having confirmed were different things, and in a situation this specific and this irreversible, the difference mattered. "I can arrange it," he said. "I know a clinic that does it quickly and privately." "I can pay for it," Victoria said. "You don't need to pay for it." "Mason." "Victoria." He looked at her directly. "Let me pay for a DNA test. That's something I can do." She held his gaze for a moment, and then something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but adjusting, the recalibration of someone recognizing that the other person in the room also needed agency in this, not just logistics. "Okay," she said. Elena had said very little in the past 10 minutes. She was looking at her coffee cup with the fixed attention of someone whose thoughts were somewhere else entirely, working through something she hadn't verbalized yet. Mason had noticed, over the course of the 2 meetings, that Elena processed things the way some people did, largely internally, the conclusions arriving fully formed after a period of apparent stillness. He remembered that about her. It was one of the things that had frustrated him at 21, and that he now recognized simply as how she was built. "Elena," he said. She looked up. "Are you all right with this?" She took a breath. "Yes," she said. "It's the right thing to do." She paused. "It's a lot of right things arriving at once, but yes." The clinic appointment was the following Saturday morning. Mason had found a medical lab on the north side of the city that offered private paternity testing with results in 4 business days and a staff clearly accustomed to handling situations with a degree of discretion. The woman at the intake desk was professional in a specific way that suggested she had processed every possible variation of this particular situation and was constitutionally incapable of surprise. They arrived separately. Mason first, then Victoria 15 minutes later. They sat in the small waiting room with its neutral colors and its carefully selected magazines, not talking much, watching the morning traffic pass the window. "Have you told anyone?" Victoria asked. She was looking at a magazine she wasn't reading. "No," Mason said. "My friend Derek knows I've been distracted. He's asked twice. I haven't—" He paused.
I haven't told Sophie anything. What will you tell her? After.
He thought about it. He'd thought about almost nothing else in the evenings after Sophie went to sleep, sitting in the kitchen with a beer going flat on the table beside him, while he tried to construct a version of this story that an 8-year-old could hold. The truth, he said. A version of it she can understand. That her dad has a daughter he didn't know about, and now he does. And that's a good thing. He paused. She won't have the full context for a while, but I won't lie to her.
Victoria was quiet. Are you nervous? She asked. About the test? About any of it. He considered the honest answer, which was more complicated than a simple yes or no.
I'm not nervous about the result, he said. We know what the result is. I'm nervous about what comes after, what it means, what it looks like when we try to build something out of this, when none of us knows how. He looked at the window. I've been a single parent for 5 years, and I've gotten reasonably good at figuring things out as I go. But this is a different category of figuring out. A nurse appeared at the door and called his name. The process itself was brief and clinical. A cheek swab, a form, a barcode on a small tube. Simple in execution for something so weighted in implication. Victoria's appointment followed immediately after, and when they reconvened in the waiting room to leave, they stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside in the cold morning air. 4 business days, she said. 4 business days, he agreed. She looked at him with an expression he was becoming better at reading. The particular quality of Victoria's face when she was allowing herself to feel something she didn't fully have words for yet. Thank you, she said, for handling this, the way you have. I know you didn't have to. It's not about what I had to do, he said. Still, he nodded. They went their separate ways. And he drove to the site because there was concrete to pour and specs to review and a city inspector coming at 11, and the work didn't wait for his personal life to resolve itself. The results arrived on a Wednesday, emailed to both of them simultaneously per the arrangement they'd made. Mason was at his desk in the small site office at the Harmon Street building when his phone showed the notification, a message from the lab with a secure link and a 4-digit access code. He sat there for a full 2 minutes without opening it. It wasn't that he was afraid of the answer. He knew the answer, but there was something about the moment before confirmation that still held a version of the world where things were simpler. And once he opened that email, that version was over permanently. He opened it. The result was what he'd known it would be. Probability of paternity, 99.998%. He put the phone down on the desk. Outside the site office windows, he could hear the percussion of construction, the rhythmic machinery of a building going up floor by floor, steel and concrete, and human effort assembling into something permanent. He had spent his adult life in the business of building structures that would outlast him. Foundations dug into the earth, load-bearing walls, the careful mathematics of what could hold weight and what couldn't. He picked up his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. I saw it, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Yeah. Silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that sits between two people when there's too much to say and they're both taking a second to let the real thing land before they try to put words on it. I don't know what I was expecting to feel, she said. I knew. We both knew, and I still... She stopped. Started again. It's different when it's confirmed. It's different when it's a number on a document. I know. Are you okay? Nobody had asked him that in a while. Not about something this specific. I think so, he said carefully. I need a little time to sit with it, but yeah, I think so. Another pause. I called my mother, Victoria said. She cried. Not falling apart crying, just... She cried quietly for a few minutes, and then she said she was sorry. And I said, I know. A beat. I don't know what the sorry covers exactly. I don't know if it covers everything or just the part she can see from where she's standing, but I said I know, and I meant it, and I think that's where we are. That's somewhere, Mason said. It's somewhere, she agreed. He told Tully he was taking an early lunch and walked 3 blocks to a small park he'd eaten in before, a pocket of green between 2 office buildings that the city had somehow preserved, and he sat on a bench with his coat collar up against the cold and let himself think about it fully for the first time. He had a daughter. Not Sophie. Sophie had been his for 8 years, bone and marrow, the whole purpose of his daily architecture. But now there was also Victoria, 30 years old, CEO of a real estate company, composed and careful and lonely in a way she managed with exceptional skill, standing alone on a highway in the rain, looking at him with her mother's eyes. He was not naive enough to think that a document changed their relationship instantly, that 30 years of separate life could be bridged by a percentage and a conversation. This was not a movie. Victoria didn't need a father in the way Sophie needed one. She was a grown woman with her own structure, her own history, her own competence. She wasn't looking for rescue. But she had spent 30 years without a father's name to put to the space her mother had kept carefully empty, and there was something in that, something about being seen and claimed and real to another person, that mattered regardless of age. He thought about that for a while. Then he went back to work. The dinner was Elena's idea. She called Mason directly, not through Victoria, not with 3 layers of careful framing, just called him on a Friday evening and said, "I'd like to cook dinner for the 3 of us. Saturday, if you're free, at my house." And then after a pause, "You could bring Sophie if that feels right. She doesn't need to know everything, but I'd like to meet her." Mason held the phone and thought about it. "Let me think about that part," he said. "The Sophie part. Give me a day." He thought about it through Saturday morning. While making pancakes, Sophie kept trying to improve with the addition of chocolate chips he kept removing from the bowl, while driving her to her friend Nadia's birthday party at a place that appeared to be entirely made of foam obstacles and controlled chaos, while sitting in the lobby of said foam obstacle arena for 2.5 hours, with a paper cup of bad coffee and a waiting room full of other parents doing the same thing. By the time he picked Sophie up, sweaty and incoherent with happiness, still wearing a paper birthday crown she refused to remove, he'd made up his mind, not the full truth. Not yet. Sophie was 8, and there were some things 8-year-olds deserved to be protected from until the adults had built a stable enough structure to present to them. But meeting Elena was not a harmful thing. He was still working out exactly what Elena was to him now, which was a project with no clear completion date, but she was not a threat to his daughter. "Hey," he said, as Sophie buckled herself in with the crown askew, "do you want to have dinner at someone's house tonight? An older lady. Really good cook, from what I hear. She has a lot of books." Sophie looked at him with the assessing expression she used when she was evaluating whether something was as simple as it was being presented. "Books like for decoration, or books like she actually reads them?" "Looks like she actually reads them." "Okay," Sophie said. "Can I keep the crown?" "You can keep the crown." Elena's house smelled like something braised and something baked, and when she opened the door and saw Sophie standing beside Mason in a birthday crown she apparently had no intention of removing, Elena's face did something unguarded and immediate, the involuntary softening of a woman who had not had a child in her house in a very long time and had missed it without fully knowing she did. "You must be Sophie," Elena said. Sophie looked up at her with the serious evaluation she gave every new person. "You have a lot of books," she said. "I do." "Do you actually read all of them?" "Most of them. Some of them I just like looking at." "That's honest," Sophie said, and walked inside. Mason met Elena's eyes over Sophie's head, and for a brief, strange moment there was something almost like ease between them. The shared recognition of a particular 8-year-old's particular personality, witnessed together from the same position. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, letting herself in with a key she apparently had from previous visits. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, stopped when she saw Sophie at the kitchen table earnestly explaining to Elena the specific nature of her objection to onions, and something moved across Victoria's expression, something that took Mason a moment to identify because it wasn't an emotion he'd seen on her before. It was tenderness, simple and unguarded and not performing itself. She caught Mason's eye, and he could see her recalibrating, adjusting, reapplying the composure she usually wore. He gave a small shake of his head. She understood. "Don't. You don't have to." She nodded almost imperceptibly. Dinner was a braised chicken dish with roasted root vegetables and a bread Elena had made that morning that Sophie declared the best bread she had ever eaten, which caused Elena a level of visible pleasure that was completely disproportionate and absolutely genuine. The conversation was careful at times and easy at others. Victoria and Elena talked about a trip Elena was planning to take in the spring. Sophie interrogated Victoria at length about what a CEO actually did on a daily basis, found the answers mostly unsatisfying in terms of action content, and then asked whether Victoria had ever been in a helicopter, which she had, and this substantially improved Victoria's standing. Mason ate more than he had at a single meal in months and watched the four of them at the table, himself included from some vantage point outside himself, and tried to understand the shape of what was assembling in front of him. After dinner, Victoria and Sophie ended up in Elena's living room. Mason could hear them from the kitchen, where he was helping Elena with the dishes, something he'd insisted on and she'd resisted, and he'd won by simply picking up a dish towel and starting. Sophie was explaining something about a book she was reading for school. Her voice carried the way it always did when she was genuinely engaged, up in volume and speed, the information coming out in clusters, circling back to fill in gaps. Victoria was asking questions. Real ones. Not the performed interest of an adult managing a child's monologue, but actual questions, the kind that came from actual curiosity. Elena was standing next to Mason at the sink, and she was listening too. And her expression was a thing he wasn't going to try to name, except that it was the expression of a woman watching something she had spent 30 years trying not to want. "She's something," Elena said quietly. "Yeah," Mason said. "She is." Elena handed him a pot. "You raised her well, alone." "She mostly raised herself," he said. "I just kept her fed and in school." Elena made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. They stood in the kitchen in silence for a while, the sound of Sophie and Victoria coming from the next room, and it was not comfortable exactly. There was still too much history in the room for comfort, too many things that had been said at the kitchen table 2 weeks ago and hadn't fully resolved, but it was something. It was coexistence. It was two people who had caused each other significant harm standing at a sink washing dishes and choosing to be in the same room anyway. "I need to ask you something," Mason said. Elena kept washing. "Okay. Why did you come back to the city? After everything?" She was quiet for a moment. "My business brought me back," she said, "about 12 years ago, ironically. Just after—" She paused. "Just after I heard about you and Carla getting married. I moved back for a contract and then stayed because my mother was getting older and needed me closer." She paused again. "I knew you were here. I told myself it was a big city and the chances of—" She didn't finish. "But you knew," Mason said. "I knew," she said. He dried the pot and hung it. "Did you ever drive past my site?" he asked. "On Harmon Street?" She turned and looked at him. "Once," she said. "About 2 years ago. Before the building went up. I parked down the block and watched for about 10 minutes. A pause. You were arguing with someone on the phone and you had your hand on your forehead like you always did when you were frustrated." He looked at the window over the sink. "Elena," he said. "I know," she said. "I know. I don't have—" "I'm not going to say it was okay," he said. "What you did. I'm not there. I might not get there. But I need you to understand that I'm also not—" He stopped, organizing it. "I have Sophie, and the years with Carla, and a life that I built out of the wreckage of everything that happened, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'd undo any of it just to get back the version where you didn't leave." He turned and looked at her directly. "But you took something from me, and from her." He tilted his head slightly toward the living room, and I needed to say that plainly, once. Elena looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She didn't look away. "I know," she said. "You're right." He nodded. They went back to the living room. Sophie had apparently gotten Victoria to pull 2 books off Elena's shelves, a novel and a field guide to North American birds, that she seemed to find inexplicably compelling, and was conducting a simultaneous comparison of their merits, while Victoria sat beside her on the couch, with the particular stillness of someone who had nowhere else in the world they'd rather be right now. Mason stood in the doorway for a moment and took it in. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a single father eating gas station sandwiches in a truck on a construction site, and now he was standing in a doorway watching his 8-year-old teach a 30-year-old billionaire about bird migration patterns. And somewhere underneath all the complexity and the grief and the unfinished business, there was something that felt not like happiness exactly. It wasn't clean enough for that, but like the thing that exists just before happiness. When the light changes and the room feels different, and you don't know yet what's coming, but you can tell it's coming. He went and sat down. Sophie handed him the field guide without looking up from her conversation with Victoria. "You should look at the woodpeckers," she said. "Page 47. They're really interesting, and I think you'd like them." He opened the book to page 47. He did not particularly care about woodpeckers, but he looked at them anyway, because sometimes the measure of how much things have changed is that you find yourself doing something small and specific and completely ordinary, and it doesn't feel ordinary at all. It was almost 9 o'clock by the time Mason stood and said that Sophie needed to get home and into bed, which Sophie disputed on the grounds that it was a Saturday, which he acknowledged, and then held his position on anyway. The negotiation followed its usual arc, Sophie deploying increasingly creative arguments, while Mason listened with genuine attentiveness and ultimately didn't move. And by the end of it, Elena was watching with an expression she hadn't bothered to conceal, the specific fascination of someone seeing a dynamic they recognized from a long way off. At the door, Sophie turned and hugged Elena. Not a polite hug, a real one, full-armed, the kind she gave people she'd already decided she liked. Elena made a sound that was very small and held on for a moment longer than Sophie did. Then Sophie turned to Victoria. "You should come back," she said. "You're pretty good at bird facts now." Victoria looked at her for a moment. "I'll work on them," she said, "so I'm better prepared next time." "Good," Sophie said, with the satisfied air of a person whose standards have been heard and acknowledged. She went to the truck. Mason stood at the door with Elena and Victoria behind him, the cold night air coming in against the warmth of the house. "Thank you," he said, to Elena mainly, but to both of them. Elena nodded. He walked down the porch steps. He was almost to the truck when Victoria said his name. He turned. She was standing at the top of the porch steps, one hand on the rail, the porch light making a small warm circle around her. "I know we're still—" She stopped, started again. "I know there's a lot we haven't figured out yet. What this looks like. What to call things. All of it." She met his eyes steadily. "But I wanted to say, I'm glad you stopped that night, on the highway. I've been thinking about it. You didn't have to, and I'm glad you did." He looked at her. In the porch light, the resemblance was still there. It would always be there. But he was beginning to see past it, or maybe through it, to the person who was her own thing entirely. The person who had grown up without a name for half of where she came from and had built herself into something formidable anyway, and who was standing on a porch in November saying something true with the careful directness of someone who didn't say things lightly. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." He got in the truck. Sophie was already buckled, the birthday crown finally removed and sitting on her lap, her head tipped slightly against the window in the way that meant she had about 15 minutes before she was asleep. "I like them," she said, without preamble. "Yeah? Elena makes really good bread and Victoria is smart. I can tell because she doesn't try to pretend she knows things she doesn't know. Most adults pretend." He started the truck. "That's pretty observant," he said. "I'm observant," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Are we going to see them again?" He pulled onto the street, the house receding in the rearview mirror, a warm-lit rectangle in the November dark. "Yeah," he said. "I think we are." Sophie settled against the window. "Good," she said. And within 10 minutes she was asleep, the crown in her lap, the Birdfield guide Elena had quietly pressed into her hands at the door, tucked under her arm, like something she planned to keep. Mason drove home through the late-night city, quiet and awake, carrying something in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Not resolution, nothing this complicated resolved in 3 weeks. Not happiness. That was too simple a word for something with this many layers. But something that was alive and moving and real, the way water is real when it starts running again through pipes that have been frozen for a long time. He drove home and put Sophie to bed without her fully waking up, and then he stood in the hallway outside her room for a moment, and then he went and stood in the living room doorway and looked at the linen closet across the hall. He opened it. The curtains were on the top shelf, still in the packaging, exactly where he'd put them 3 years ago. He stood there for a moment, then he took them down. He didn't hang them that night, he just put them on the kitchen table. But they were out of the closet, which was different from where they'd been. And sometimes that's the thing, not the finishing, but the first move. Not the curtains on the wall, but the curtains on the table, which is its own kind of progress, and not nothing. He went to bed. He slept. The curtains stayed on the kitchen table for 4 days. Mason walked past them every morning while making coffee, every evening while making dinner, and each time he registered their presence the way you register something you've left in the middle of a room intentionally. A reminder to yourself from an earlier version of yourself who had momentum that the current version keeps not quite finding. On the 5th day, Sophie moved them to the counter without comment. On the 6th day, she said, "Are we going to hang those, or are they a decoration now?" And he said, "We're going to hang them." And she said, "When?" And he said, "Soon." And she gave him the particular look of an 8-year-old who has learned that soon is a word adults use when they mean not yet, but I need you to stop asking. He hung them on a Sunday morning in December, while Sophie sat on the couch watching and providing an ongoing commentary on his ladder technique that he did not request and that she provided freely anyway. They were white with a thin linen weave. They let light through without making the room feel exposed. Carla had good taste, he thought. She'd had good taste about most things. "They look nice," Sophie said when he climbed down. "Yeah," he said, "they do." He folded the ladder and carried it back to the garage. And when he came back through the living room, the morning light was coming through the linen in a way that changed the quality of the room, made it look less like a place someone was camping in temporarily, and more like somewhere a person actually lived. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Then he went and made breakfast. December moved in the way December does in the city, cold and compressed, the days short enough that by the time he got home from the site, the sky was already dark. The neighborhood houses lit up in rectangles of warm interior light. The Harmon Street project had entered its interior phase, which meant different kinds of problems and different kinds of meetings, and the particular professional tension of a job that was close enough to done that everyone was starting to get ahead of themselves. Victoria had texted him twice in the 2 weeks since Elena's dinner, once to send him a photograph of a bird guide she'd found at a bookstore. With the message, page 47 has better woodpeckers than Elena's copy, in case Sophie wants a comparison, and wants to ask if he'd be interested in looking at the Sinclair Group's current development projects in the Milford district, since they had 2 properties near the Harmon Street site, and she thought there might be some professional overlap worth discussing. He had responded to the bird guide text immediately and taken 3 days to respond to the professional one, not because he wasn't interested, but because he was trying to work out where the line was. Between the personal thing they were still building and the professional world he lived in, and whether mixing them was wise or just convenient. He decided it was probably both, which was honest, and he agreed to the meeting. They met on a Wednesday in the Sinclair Group's main conference room on the 28th floor of their downtown building. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table large enough to seat 20, and Mason arrived in clean work clothes that were his best attempt at the middle ground between a construction site and a corporate boardroom, and spent approximately the first 30 seconds after walking in recalibrating to the environment. Victoria was already there, along with a project manager named Dana and an architect named Reeves, whom Mason had actually crossed paths with once before on a different development. The professional context made things easier in some ways and slightly surreal in others. Mason had to periodically remind himself while discussing drainage specifications and zoning variances that the woman across the table from him had a test result on her phone matching 99.998% of his DNA. He was professional. Victoria was professional. Dana and Reeves had no idea anything was unusual, and Mason was reasonably confident they'd both go home that evening and say nothing about the meeting more interesting than that the contractor from the Harmon Street job had been reasonably well prepared. After Dana and Reeves left, Victoria poured herself a second coffee and sat back down across from him. "You're good at this," she said. "I've been doing it a while." "The compartmentalization," she said, "sitting in that meeting and being completely normal." "You were completely normal too," he said. "I had the home field advantage." She looked at her coffee. "And I've been compartmentalizing for 30 years, so the bar is set high." He looked at the city through the windows. From up here, the construction sites were just geometry, rectangles and angles, and the small moving figures of workers he recognized as his own people from a different altitude. "How are you?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that told him she was going to give him a real answer rather than a functional one. "I've been having a hard time sleeping," she said. "Not because anything is wrong, exactly. More because I keep
There's a lot to process, and my brain won't do it efficiently on schedule. She turned her cup. I called Elena 3 times this week, which is more than usual. She's being patient about it. What do you talk about?
Mostly nothing directly about this. We talk about her trip plans. She tells me about things she's reading. But I think we're both doing the same thing, which is just maintaining contact because the contact feels important right now. She paused. Does that make sense? Yeah, he said. It does. What about you? He thought about the curtains, about sleeping through the night for the first time in recent memory, 2 nights ago, without the particular 3 a.m. wakefulness that had been his companion for most of 5 years. Better than I was a month ago, he said honestly. Something has settled. I don't know if it's the right word, but something has settled. She looked at him. Can I tell you something? She said. Yeah, I've been in therapy for 4 years, she said, with the directness of someone who had decided not to be embarrassed by the fact. And I was talking to my therapist about all of this, everything that's happened since the highway, and she asked me something that I've been sitting with. She paused. She asked what I was most afraid of, about all of this, about you. What did you say? I said I was afraid that I'd want something that you couldn't give, that I'd start to need something from this relationship that it wasn't able to be. She met his eyes steadily. And she asked what that something was, and I said, I think I said that I was afraid of needing a father, which feels like a ridiculous thing to say at 30. Mason looked at her. It's not ridiculous, he said. It feels ridiculous. Victoria, you've spent 30 years without a father in the picture. The need doesn't expire at 18, it just goes underground. He held her gaze. And I'm not going to pretend I've worked out what this looks like yet, either. But I'm not here by accident, and I'm not here because of a test result. I'm here because I pulled over in a rainstorm and met someone I wanted to know better. The rest is, he searched for the word. The rest is context. She was quiet for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. Quietly. Okay, he agreed. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. And somewhere in the 28th floor conference room, with the city spread out below them and a table large enough for 20 with only 2 people at it, something shifted towards something else. Not dramatically, not with music or ceremony, but the way things shift when 2 careful people simultaneously decide to stop being quite as careful. The first Saturday in December, Victoria showed up at Mason's house. She had called the day before to ask if it was all right, which he'd appreciated, and he'd said yes, come around noon. We'll probably be making lunch. She arrived at 12:07 with a paper bag that turned out to contain 3 different kinds of cheese, a baguette, and 2 types of soup from a place on her side of the city that she'd described only as good, which was accurate. Sophie opened the door, looked at the bag and said, "Is that soup?" And when Victoria said yes, Sophie stepped aside and said, "Okay, come in," with the air of someone who has established her governing criteria and found them satisfied. Mason was in the kitchen when they came through, and he watched Victoria navigate the space. The organized chaos of a working household with an 8-year-old in it, the stack of Sophie's library books on the counter, the dog-eared permission slip on the refrigerator door, the crayon drawing of what appeared to be a dinosaur in a business suit that Sophie had produced last Tuesday and posted at eye level like a statement piece. Victoria looked at the dinosaur drawing without comment, then looked at Mason with a raised eyebrow. She had a business unit at school, he said. I see. The dinosaur is a CEO. That tracks, Victoria said, and set the bag down on the counter. They ate at the kitchen table, soup from bowls, bread torn rather than sliced because Sophie said tearing was more efficient, and Victoria agreed, cheese on the side. And the conversation went in 3 directions at once, the way conversations do when a child is at the table and has opinions about everything and no particular filter on when to deploy them. Sophie wanted to know whether the Sinclair Group had ever built anything that fell down, which Victoria said no. Though one project in 2019 had developed a significant crack in a parking structure that had required emergency repair, and this information satisfied Sophie in a way that more positive answers might not have. Sophie wanted to know why Victoria's company was named Sinclair and not Brooks, since her last name was Sinclair, and whether she'd changed it. Victoria looked at Mason briefly. Sinclair was the name of a mentor of mine, she said. He was the person who gave me my first real opportunity in business. When I took over running the company, I kept the name because he'd built it and because I wanted to honor that.
That's nice, Sophie said.
What was he like?
Old and demanding and occasionally very funny, Victoria said. He expected a lot and made you feel like being expected a lot of was a privilege.
That sounds like Mason, Sophie said.
Mason looked up from his soup.
What? He said.
You expect a lot, Sophie said, unbothered. Mrs. Pruitt says you're the kind of person who has high standards and that it's a feature, not a bug. Mrs. Pruitt said that? Last week. Victoria was visibly working to not laugh.
After lunch, Sophie retreated to her room for what she called reading time, and what Mason knew to be a flexible category that included actual reading, drawing, whatever podcast she was currently into, and on occasion simply lying on her floor thinking, which she did with an earnestness that he found both endearing and slightly concerning. He and Victoria ended up in the living room. She stood for a moment at the window with the linen curtains, looking out at the street, and the winter light came through the fabric the way it had on that first Sunday morning when he'd hung them. You hung the curtains, she said, a few weeks ago. She turned from the window and looked at the room. The worn but decent couch, the bookshelves that were more functional than decorative, Sophie's stuffed elephant sitting on the armchair at a precise angle that suggested it had been deliberately positioned. This is a good house, she said. It's small.
That's not what I said. He looked at her.
No, he said. You're right, it's a good house. She sat down in the armchair, gently relocating the stuffed elephant first, placing it on the cushion beside her with a care that he noticed and said nothing about. Can I ask you something personal? She said. You've been asking me personal things since a rainstorm in November. I think we're past the permission stage. When did you start, She paused, choosing words. When did the house start feeling like yours again? After Carla. He sat on the couch. The question landed in a specific place, not painfully, but with the particular weight of things that are true and rarely asked.
I don't know if it fully has, he said honestly. There are parts of it that are clearly mine now. The way I've organized things, Sophie's fingerprints all over everything, the way it runs. But there are corners. He stopped. There are corners that still feel like they're waiting for her to come back and finish something she started. I don't know if that goes away. I've stopped expecting it to. Victoria was quiet. I'm sorry, she said, not performing the apology, just meaning it.
I know, he said. Thank you. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the house making its small sounds around them, Sophie's voice coming faintly from down the hall, apparently narrating something to herself or possibly to the stuffed elephant's counterpart. My apartment, Victoria said eventually, is the opposite problem. It's extremely mine. Every surface is chosen, every object is placed. My assistant calls it aggressively curated. I take it as a compliment, but she does not mean it as one. He smiled. But there's nothing in it that isn't intentional, she continued. Nothing that got there by accident or by someone else's choice or by the general accumulation of a life being lived. It's all decisions. She looked at the elephant on the cushion beside her. I don't think I understood until recently that there's a difference between a space that's curated and a space that's inhabited. Your apartment sounds lonely, he said. He hadn't meant to say it that plainly. It is, she said, with no defensiveness, just fact. He nodded. The afternoon went on in the easy, slightly surprising way that good afternoons do when nobody has an agenda. Sophie reappeared around 3 with the Birdfield guide Elena had given her, which she had apparently been cross-referencing with the one Victoria had photographed for her, and she had questions. Specific, detailed, earnest questions about bird migration that neither Mason nor Victoria could fully answer, but that Victoria engaged with such genuine interest that Sophie declared her actually useful, which Mason had learned over 8 years was one of the higher honors his daughter dispensed. Victoria stayed until 5. At the door, putting on her coat, she turned to Sophie. Same time next week, Sophie said, with the casualness of someone who had already made the decision that this was a recurring arrangement. Victoria glanced at Mason. He shrugged in a way that communicated, she makes her own social calendar. I've learned to accept this. Same time next week, Victoria said, and she left, and Sophie immediately went back to her room.
and Mason stood in the hallway for a moment with the particular quiet of a house that has recently had more people in it than usual and is now finding its shape again. It was a good quiet, different from the quiet he'd been living in. The Saturdays developed their own rhythm. Not every week. Victoria had work trips and obligations that took her out of the city sometimes, and Mason had site weeks that required weekend presence, and Sophie had her own life that was in no way organized around adult schedules, but often enough that it became a pattern, a familiar groove in the week that all three of them seemed to orient toward without discussing it directly. Some Saturdays they ate lunch at Mason's house. Some they went out, once to a museum that Sophie had been lobbying to visit for months, once to a farmer's market in the Park District, where Sophie spent 20 minutes interrogating a cheese vendor with a thoroughness that left the vendor both exhausted and impressed. Once, in January, to Elena's house again, where the four of them spent an afternoon that was less charged than the first one and contained significantly more laughter, which felt like progress of a real and measurable kind. Victoria started to know the house. She knew where the extra coffee was kept, and she knew that Sophie took her hot chocolate with one less teaspoon of sugar than the package suggested, and she knew that Mason's habit of leaving his tape measure on the kitchen counter was not carelessness, but just the way his brain organized tools he used daily. She knew that the third stair from the bottom creaked, and that it would startle you every time if you forgot it. Mason started to know her patterns too. He knew she arrived early to everything, always. Not aggressively early, just 5 or 7 minutes. The habit of someone whose professional life required her to be the person already present when others arrived. He knew she read the news over coffee, and that she had strong opinions about urban development policy that she expressed with restraint in casual settings, but with considerable precision when directly asked. He knew that she was uncomfortable with receiving help, not rudely, but reflexively, the deep instinct of someone who had spent 30 years being competent at everything as a form of self-protection, and that she was slowly, incrementally, getting better at accepting a cup of coffee someone else had made, without treating it like a transaction that required immediate repayment. One Saturday in late January, she came over and found the kitchen in a state that required explanation. Sophie had been attempting to make pancakes from a recipe she'd found online, which had been imprecise about the batter consistency, and the result was spread across approximately 40% of the available kitchen surfaces in a way that made the room look like a crime scene investigated in syrup. Mason was in the garage getting a mop, which he had apparently needed more urgently than he anticipated, and when Victoria walked in through the unlocked door, she found Sophie standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the situation with the expression of a person who has moved past the initial alarm and is now in the assessment phase. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," Victoria said, looking at the surfaces. "The recipe was misleading," Sophie said. "I see that. Also, I may have added too much baking powder." "What made you think that?" Sophie pointed to a section of the ceiling. Victoria looked at the ceiling. "Okay," she said, and took off her coat. "Where are the paper towels?" By the time Mason came back from the garage with the mop, Victoria and Sophie had cleared roughly half the damage and were working with the focused coordination of people who had identified the problem and divided the territory. Victoria was at the counter, Sophie was at the stove. The conversation going between them was about whether the recipe could be salvaged or whether this constituted a total loss and they should order something. Mason stood in the doorway. He watched his daughter and Victoria navigate the chaos of his kitchen together, and he felt something move through his chest that he wasn't entirely prepared for. Not dramatic, not thunderclap, just a steady, warm thing that arrived and stayed. "Are you going to help or observe?" Sophie said without turning around. "I'm observing," he said. "Observing is not helpful, Mason." Victoria glanced back at him over her shoulder, and she was smiling, really smiling, unguarded, the kind his face made when something was genuinely funny and she forgot to manage it. He got the mop. They did not save the pancake batter. They ordered food from the Thai place 3 blocks over that Sophie had been requesting for 2 weeks, and they ate it at the kitchen table, which Victoria and Sophie had cleaned to a standard that Mason found genuinely impressive. Sophie fell asleep on the couch at 4 in the afternoon, the particular sudden unconsciousness of a child who has expended significant physical and creative energy with the TV on low playing a nature documentary she'd wanted Victoria to see. Mason covered her with the throw blanket from the armchair. He and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with tea, speaking quietly so as not to wake Sophie.
She's going to ask soon, Victoria said. Mason looked at her.
About what I am to her, Victoria said. She's too smart not to have noticed that this isn't normal. An adult who shows up on Saturdays, who knows where the coffee is, who cleans the kitchen ceiling with her. She looked at her tea. She hasn't asked yet because she's decided to wait until she has enough information to ask the right question. But she's collecting information. He knew Victoria was right. He'd seen it, the occasional quiet look Sophie gave them when she thought neither of them was watching. The way she'd started saying Victoria with a particular ease, like the name had settled into a usual slot. I know, he said. What are you going to tell her? He was quiet for a moment. The truth, he said. Age appropriate, but the truth. She's going to find out eventually, and I would rather she find out from me, the right way, than piece it together herself and wonder why I let her do that. Victoria nodded slowly. Are you nervous about it? She asked. Terrified, he said, simply and without performance. What are you most scared of? He looked at the table. That she'll feel like she's been replaced, he said, or supplemented, that having you in the picture will make her feel like what we have isn't enough, that she'll get confused about what she is to me and what you are to me, and that the confusion will hurt her. Victoria was quiet. She knows what she is to you, she said finally. You can see it every time she's in the same room as you. She's not a child who wonders whether she's loved. Kids are good at wondering about things that are obvious to everyone else, he said. True? She looked at her tea. But she's also the kind of kid who processes things directly. She's not going to build a story in her head if you give her the real one. He looked at his daughter asleep on the couch, one foot hanging off the edge, mouth slightly open, completely surrendered to sleep the way only children can be. She's my whole life, he said. Quietly, not sentimentally, just stating a fact. I know, Victoria said. And she's the reason you're capable of this, of what we're building here. You don't get to be the kind of father you are without it costing you something, and also without it making you into someone who knows how to stay in things, who doesn't leave when it gets complicated. He looked at her. She met his gaze steadily. That's what I've been missing, she said, my whole life. Someone who stays in the complicated part. He didn't look away. I stay, he said. I know, she said. That's why I keep coming back on Saturdays. February arrived, and with it the particular cold that the city saved for late winter. Not dramatic, not the deep freeze of January, but an insistent gray chill that settled in and refused to lift. The Harmon Street project was 3 months from completion, which meant the final inspection calendar was becoming a full-time management problem, and Mason was spending significant energy keeping the schedule intact against the usual late-stage pressures of a large build. He told Sophie about Victoria on a Thursday evening in February. He had chosen Thursday deliberately, a school night, which meant Sophie would have structure the next day, a reason to put things in their places and move through a regular morning. He'd learned in 5 years of delivering hard or complicated information to a child that structure helped her process things. The absence of structure let her spiral. They were at the kitchen table after dinner. Sophie was doing math homework she found relatively easy and therefore boring, and she was doing the thing she did with boring homework, where she completed it at triple speed while also eating an apple and reading a paragraph of her library book between problems. Hey, Mason said, can you stop for a minute? She looked up. He had thought about this extensively. He had versions. He had language that was true and not too much for an 8-year-old. He had prepared. He said, you know how some things about our family are different from other families? Sophie put down her apple. She was listening with both eyes in the way she listened when she knew the actual conversation was starting. Yeah, she said. So, you know how Victoria has been coming over a lot, and we've been spending time with her and with Elena. Yeah. Victoria is... He stopped, started again. I had a person I cared about a long time ago, before your mom. Before everything. And Victoria is... He looked at his daughter. Victoria is my daughter, from a long time ago, before I knew. And I found out recently, and that's why she's been around. Sophie was very still. He waited. So she's like my sister, Sophie said. He blinked. Half-sister, he said. Yes, technically. Sophie considered this. She's really old for a sister, she said. She's 30. That's very old. It's not that old, Sophie thought for another moment. He waited, watching her face move through the processing, the information going in and being sorted and held up against what she already knew and finding its place. Does she know? Sophie asked. Yeah, she knows. We've talked about it. She's okay with it. Does she know about me? Yes, she likes you. You know she likes you.
Sophie looked at her math homework for a moment without seeing it. Is that why she cleans the kitchen with me? She said. Partly, Mason said. And partly because she's like that. She shows up and helps. Sophie was quiet. Does Elena know? She asked. Yes. Is that why Elena gave me the bird book? He hadn't thought about it from that angle, but he looked at it from Sophie's angle now and saw the through line she'd drawn, which was accurate. Probably, he said. Sophie picked up her apple. Okay, she said. He waited for more. That's okay, he said carefully. She looked at him with the expression she used when she found him slightly behind the pace of a conversation. I have an older sister who knows where the coffee is and cleans up pancake messes and likes bird books, she said. That's better than what most people have. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said with some difficulty. I think that's right. Sophie went back to her math. He sat at the table for a moment, running his hand over his face once, and then he got up and started clearing the dishes, and the kitchen was quiet and ordinary and warm. He texted Victoria at 9 o'clock that night, after Sophie was asleep. I told her tonight. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then, how did it go? He looked at his phone. She asked if you knew where the coffee is. I said yes. She said okay. A pause. Then, that might be the best thing anyone has ever said about me. He set his phone down. Outside, the February city was doing its usual cold and relentless thing, traffic and wind and the distant percussion of a place that never quite stopped. And inside the house, the curtains were on the windows and the light was on in the kitchen, and Sophie's homework was finished on the table, and the stuffed elephant was in its position on the armchair. And Mason stood in the kitchen after 9 p.m. on a Thursday and felt, for the first time in a long time, like all the rooms of his life were occupied. Not full. It wasn't that. Some rooms were still quiet in ways that would never fully change. Carla's absence was a permanent architecture in the house, something you built around rather than removed. He knew that. He had made his peace with building around it, but occupied. That was the word. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and this time he slept straight through until morning. Spring came to the city the way it usually did, not all at once, not as an announcement, but gradually and then suddenly, the way things change when you've stopped watching for them. One morning in March, Mason drove to the Harmon Street site and noticed the trees along the boulevard had gone from bare to the faint pale green of new buds overnight, and he sat in the truck for a moment before getting out and looked at them, and thought that he had not noticed a season change in several years, not really noticed it. He'd been too deep inside the machinery of surviving each day to look at trees. He noticed them now. The Harmon Street project reached completion on a Thursday in late March, not without its final complications, because no large project ends without final complications, and the last 3 weeks had required a dispute with a tile subcontractor, an electrical inspection that found a wiring issue on the 9th floor that cost 4 days to resolve, and a conversation with the project owner that Mason had prepared for extensively, and which had gone better than expected but still required 2 hours he didn't have. But the certificate of occupancy was issued on a Thursday afternoon, and Mason stood on the sidewalk outside the finished building with Tully and 2 other foremen and looked at the thing they'd built from a foundation hole to a 12-story structure standing solid in the March light. Good job, Tully said, which from Tully was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Good job, Mason agreed. He called Sophie from the site to tell her, and she said, Does this mean we can do something fun this weekend because you won't be stressed about the building? And he said yes, and she said, I want to go to that market with the cheese lady again, and also I want to invite Victoria. And he said okay to both. He sent Victoria a text that said, Harmon Street is officially done. She responded within 2 minutes with congratulations. That building is going to be excellent. Also, Sophie already texted me about Saturday. He looked at his phone. She has your number? She's had my number since January. I thought you knew. He had not known. He stood on the sidewalk outside the finished building and looked at the text and felt something that was mostly amusement, and around the edges was something warmer. She didn't tell me. She told me not to tell you. I assumed that meant she was testing something. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked up at the building. 12 floors. Retail on the ground level, residential on 4 through 12. Load-bearing walls calculated to hold weight for decades. A foundation dug into the earth and poured and set before anything else could go on top of it. He thought about foundations a lot these days. Not the professional kind, though those too. The other kind. The invisible structural work that happens before anything else. That nobody sees because by the time there's something to look at, the foundation is buried underneath it. The thing about foundations, in construction and in everything else, is that you can't rush them. You dig down to stable ground first. You don't build on fill if you can help it. And you accept that the process of getting to stable ground takes however long it takes, and trying to speed it up generally produces something that will fail in ways you won't see coming. He had been trying for 5 years to build a life on top of grief that hadn't finished settling. The curtains in the closet were a symptom of that. Not a failure of love or will, but evidence of a man trying to build the next floor before the previous one was ready to hold weight. Something had changed. He wasn't sure exactly when. Maybe the night on the highway. Maybe the kitchen table in Ardmore Heights. Maybe the Thursday evening when Sophie had looked at information that should have complicated her world and said, okay, and picked up her apple. But something had changed, and the change was not a resolution of grief. Grief didn't resolve. He'd learned that with absolute certainty. But a different relationship to it. Less a weight he was carrying and more a room in the house. Present, real. But not the only room. The Saturday at the farmer's market was the kind of day that March occasionally produces as an apology for everything it's put you through. Warm enough for light jackets, the sky a clear, unambiguous blue, the park full of people who had been inside for months and were now blinking in the light like they'd forgotten it existed. Sophie led them through the stalls with the focused navigation of someone who had a destination and 2 adults to manage. She stopped at a bread vendor and negotiated a sample with the confidence of a person who knew exactly what she wanted and saw no reason not to ask directly. She stopped at a plant stall and had a 3-minute conversation with the vendor about whether succulents were actually low maintenance or whether that was a lie people told to sell succulents, which the vendor found both challenging and fair. Victoria walked beside Mason while Sophie ranged ahead of them, and they talked about work. She had a development project in the Eastern District that was running into zoning complications, and he had opinions about the district's planning office that were not entirely charitable. And the conversation had the easy quality of 2 people who had moved past the point of performing engagement and were just actually talking. At one point, Sophie doubled back and walked between them for a stretch without explanation, one hand finding Mason's and the other finding Victoria's, and then apparently satisfied with whatever she'd needed to check, she released both and went ahead again to examine a honey stall. Mason and Victoria did not comment on it, but he glanced at her and she was looking at Sophie's retreating back with the expression he'd come to know as her unguarded one, the one she didn't always catch in time. She did that on purpose, Victoria said quietly. Of course she did, he said. 8 years old. Going on 45, he said. I've been saying this for years. Victoria almost laughed. She's testing whether it's stable. Yeah. Is it? He looked at the market around them, the color and the noise and the March light, Sophie ahead at the honey stall now, in an animated conversation with the vendor, her jacket half unzipped, completely herself in every context she encountered. Yeah, he said. I think it is. The hard conversation happened in April. Not dramatic, not preceded by warning signs, just the particular timing of things that have been accumulating reaching the point where they have to come out. It was a Sunday evening at Mason's house. Sophie had a sleepover at Nadia's, and Victoria had stayed for dinner. She did that sometimes now, stayed past what a scheduled visit would suggest, the departures becoming gradually less defined. They were washing dishes, which had become their thing without anyone deciding it, the same way the curtains came down from the shelf without a ceremony, the way the Saturdays found their rhythm. And Victoria said, without prelude, I need to tell you something, and I've been putting it off because I'm not sure how it lands. Mason handed her a rinsed plate. Okay, he said. She put the plate in the drying rack. 3 months ago, she said carefully, my board approached me about a merger. A significant one. A company out of Chicago, Caldwell Partners. They're in the same sector, comparable scale. The merger would make strategic sense. The combined entity would be one of the largest private real estate firms on the eastern seaboard. Okay, he said again. The terms they proposed involved relocating the primary operational base to Chicago. She kept her eyes on the sink. It was on the table, and I spent about 6 weeks genuinely considering it. Mason was quiet. Before November, she said. Before the highway. I would have taken it. He processed that. And now, he said. She finally looked at him. I declined it 2 weeks ago. She held his gaze. I'm telling you now because I don't want there to be things I'm not telling you, and because I want to be honest about the fact that that what we have here is a reason, not the only reason. There were legitimate business reasons to decline as well, and I made a sound professional argument. But you and Sophie are a reason, and I want you to know that without it being a weight I put on you. He set down the dish he was holding. Victoria, I'm not asking for anything in return, she said quickly. This isn't a declaration. I just don't want to be the kind of person who makes significant decisions partly based on personal reasons and then keeps that information private from the people those reasons involve. That feels like its own kind of dishonesty. He looked at her. He understood what she was doing. She was trying to be the opposite of the thing her mother had been. She was trying to say the important things instead of carrying them in a way that shaped her choices without the other person's knowledge. She was 30 years old and trying to dismantle a pattern that had been in her life from the beginning, and she was doing it imperfectly and directly and with her hands still slightly wet from dishwater. He respected it immensely. Thank you, he said, for telling me. You're not uncomfortable with it. Why would I be uncomfortable? Because it makes the situation, she searched for the word. Real, he said. She exhaled. Yes, she said. Real. He leaned against the counter. Victoria, he said. I hung curtains in December that had been in a closet for 3 years. I slept through the night for the first time in recent memory. My daughter has your phone number and has been conducting what she considers a covert operation to determine whether you're stable, which you apparently are. He paused. The situation is already real. You declining a merger so you don't have to move to Chicago is not the thing that made it real. It's been real. She looked at him. Okay, she said. For the third or fourth time in their acquaintance, that word landing with more weight than its size suggested. Okay, he agreed. They finished the dishes. The conversation he had not anticipated having was with Elena on a Tuesday in April when they had what had become a semi-regular lunch fest. Just the two of them, which had started awkwardly around the time of the kitchen table and had gradually become something he did not have a clean word for. Not friendship, exactly. The history was too complicated for that. Not obligation. Something that existed in its own category. Two people who had known each other when they were young and foolish, who had hurt each other in ways neither fully intended, who were now in the same orbit because of a person they'd made together and were trying to figure out how to be. They met at a place on Millbrook Avenue that Elena liked, small and Italian and busy enough that the ambient noise provided natural privacy. She asked how the Harmon Street project had finished, and he gave her the summary. She asked about Sophie's school performance, which had apparently been reported to Elena via Victoria via some channel he didn't fully track. He reported that Sophie was reading above her grade level and had recently submitted a school project about bird migration that her teacher had sent home with a note calling it exceptional, and which Sophie had responded to by saying the teacher had a limited frame of reference. Elena laughed at that. A real full laugh. He watched her. He had been watching her across meals for several months now, accumulating a picture of who Elena was at 42 that he placed carefully alongside who she had been at 20. They were different people in the ways everyone is different between 20 and 42, shaped by time, by work, by decisions made and consequences absorbed. But certain things were the same: the precision of her thinking, the warmth that appeared sideways, not directly, in the way she asked questions and listened to answers, the capacity for guilt she'd always had, which he had once found frustrating and now recognized as the other side of a moral seriousness he'd always respected. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You've been asking me things for months, Mason. Just ask." "Do you regret it?" "All of it. The decision you made." She looked at him steadily. "I regret the harm," she said. "I regret what it cost you and what it cost Victoria. The years, the absence, the space where something should have been." She paused. "I don't regret Victoria. She is the best thing I have ever done. And I am aware of the irony that the decision I made to protect everyone involved is also the decision that hurt everyone involved." She looked at the table. "At 20, I thought I was being selfless. By 30, I understood I was also being afraid. By 40, I understood that the two things can be simultaneously true, and that doesn't make either one more forgivable." He nodded. "What I can tell you," she said, "is that watching the three of you, you and Sophie and Victoria, watching what you're building together, it is the closest thing I have to—" She stopped, reorganized. "It is the thing I didn't know I was hoping for when I finally told the truth. I hoped we'd survive the conversation. I didn't dare hope for this." He was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," he said. "What happened?" "I've thought about it a lot, and I keep coming back to the same place, which is that I can't call it okay because it wasn't, but I don't carry it the same way anymore. It's more like a scar that's healed, still there, not still bleeding." She nodded. "That's more than I deserve," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but it's where I am." The waitress brought their food. They ate. Outside the window, the April city moved in its usual urgent way, and Mason sat across from the woman he had loved at 21 and ate pasta and talked about construction timelines and Victoria's ongoing battle with a particularly resistant zoning board. And it was not a reconciliation, and it was not a resolution, and it was not the clean ending that stories are supposed to have. It was just two people having lunch, which, given everything, felt like something close to remarkable. The evening that Mason would later think of as the one where everything finally settled happened in late October, almost exactly a year after the highway. It was a Friday evening, and the sky was doing that particular autumn thing where it couldn't decide between clearing and overcast, and had compromised on a kind of pewter luminosity that made the city look like a photograph of itself. Victoria came over after work. She did that more often now. Not every week, but often enough that Sophie had stopped mentioning it as an event and had started treating it as weather, something that happened and was factored into the day's plan. She arrived still in work clothes, a blazer over a dark sweater, and she shed the blazer on the armchair next to the stuffed elephant and immediately went to the kitchen to start coffee, which she could now do in Mason's kitchen without asking where anything was. Elena came at 6. She had started coming to some of the Friday dinners, not all of them, not with the regularity of Victoria's Saturdays, but often enough. She and Sophie had developed a thing of their own, a shared book that Elena would read and Sophie would read, and they'd discuss it with the mutual seriousness of people who considered reading a contact sport. Currently, it was a novel about a girl who discovers her grandmother was a code breaker in World War II, and Elena had apparently been presenting Sophie with historical context over text messages that Sophie was using to annotate her copy. Mason cooked dinner, a chili he'd been making in cold weather since before Sophie was born. The recipe from Derek's mother, who had given it to him at 23 on the grounds that every person should know how to make one real cold weather meal, and this was her contribution to his development as a human being. He made it too spicy for Sophie every time, and every time Sophie said it was too spicy and ate it anyway, which he understood as a point of pride for both of them. Sophie was at the table doing homework, or the version of homework that happened with 3 adults in the kitchen and the general distraction of an active household. She was working on a writing assignment, a personal essay for her English class, and she had been asking for input with the selective editorial attitude of someone who wanted reaction without interference. "Read this part," she said to Victoria, shoving a notebook across the table. Victoria picked it up and read in silence for a moment. "The second sentence is better than the first," she said. "The first is trying too hard. The second just says the thing." "That's what I thought," Sophie said, taking the notebook back and crossing out the first sentence with the decisiveness of someone who had needed confirmation, not guidance. Elena was reading on the couch in the living room. Mason could see her through the kitchen doorway, turned sideways with her feet up the way she sat when she was genuinely into something, which he recognized as the same way Victoria sat when she was genuinely into something. The kitchen smelled like chili and the coffee Victoria had made and the cold coming off everyone's coats. The window over the sink had fogged slightly from the heat of the stove. The stuffed elephant was in its position on the armchair. And Mason stood at the stove and looked at his kitchen and felt, not happiness exactly, though happiness was present and real, but something broader and more specific at once. The feeling of a structure that had been tested and had held. Not because it was perfect, not because the materials were flawless or the load calculations had been easy, or the foundation had been found without difficulty, but because the people involved had been willing to do the work, to keep doing it past the point where it was comfortable, to choose the real thing over the easier false version of it. He thought about the highway in November, the rain and the hazard lights, and the figure standing in the storm who had turned to face him and had his late love's eyes. He had almost not stopped. He told himself he almost hadn't stopped because he was tired, because people didn't stop on dark highways, because there were rules he'd made for himself, and one of them was to keep moving. But he had stopped, not because he was obligated to, not because something compelled him, but because something in him recognized, before his brain had caught up, that here was a moment that needed the version of himself who chose the complicated thing instead of the simple one. He wondered sometimes about the shape of a life, how much of it was made in the large declared moments, and how much in the small unconsidered ones. The decision to pull over, which had taken less than 5 seconds. The decision to take a business card because not taking it had felt like the wrong kind of conversation. The decision to dial a number he'd been carrying for a week and say out loud the thing he'd been turning over in silence. He thought about what Victoria had said in a conference room in December, that what she'd been missing, her whole life, was someone who stayed in the complicated part. He thought about Elena at 20, making a calculation alone in a bathroom with a test in her hand, and the 30 years she'd spent living inside that decision, and the courage it had taken to sit at her own kitchen table and say yes to a question she'd been avoiding since before Victoria could speak. He thought about Sophie on a Thursday night with a homework assignment in front of her, absorbing information that would have destabilized most children, and saying okay and picking up her apple. The particular unshakable quality of a child who has been securely loved, it was the single most important thing he had ever built, and he had built it largely by accident, by just showing up every day and refusing to stop. None of it was perfect. None of it had been clean. Elena still carried guilt she probably always would. Victoria still had evenings where the loneliness of 30 years without a father's name had a specific gravity, and she would call Mason at odd hours to talk about nothing much, and he understood what the call was, and he answered every time. Mason still had mornings where Carla's absence was architectural, present in the structure of the day, in the quiet of a Sunday, in Sophie's laugh that went all the way through her. The scar was still there. It was healed, but it was there. And the house was occupied now, in all its rooms. After dinner, Sophie wanted to show Elena the essay she'd been working on, which meant relocating to the living room, which meant the table got cleared in the way it always got cleared now. Multiple people doing different parts of it without assignment, knowing where things went, fitting into each other's rhythms without commentary. Victoria brought the coffee cups. Elena took the chili pot to the counter. Sophie gathered her own things with the efficiency of someone who had been held to that standard since she was old enough to carry a plate. Mason wiped down the table. He looked up at one point and saw all three of them in the kitchen. Elena at the counter, Victoria at the sink, Sophie moving between them with her notebook. And the image did something to his chest that he had no clean word for. Not a word for it in any language he knew, which suggested it was the kind of thing that exists before language, underneath it, in the structural level that holds everything else up. He folded the dishcloth. He went to the living room doorway and looked out at the porch through the glass of the front door. The October night outside was dark and slightly damp, the streetlights making pale circles on the wet pavement, the trees across the street stripped to their late October architecture of bare branches. He heard Victoria behind him. She came and stood beside him at the doorway, coffee cup in her hand, looking at the same view. "Almost a year," she said. "Almost," he said. They stood in companionable quiet. "I've been thinking about moving," she said. Not with drama, not as a declaration. The tone of someone thinking out loud to someone they trust with unfinished thoughts. He looked at her. "Not far," she said. "I'm not. The apartment is just. It's what you said. It's lonely. I've been looking at some places in this district, walking distance, more or less." She looked at the street. "Sophie hasn't been consulted yet. That seems like an important step." She will absolutely have opinions, he said. I know. That's partly why I want to do it. The opinions. He looked at her profile. Victoria, he said. She turned. I'm glad you were on that highway, he said. She held his eyes. I was standing in the rain for 40 minutes, she said, in an expensive coat. I know. I was cold and my driver was 40 minutes away. I know. I'm less glad about that part. Yeah, he said. Fair. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd come to know as her real one. The one underneath all the composure and the precision and the 30 years of building herself into something that didn't need anyone to stay. The one that looked like a person who had been lonely for a long time and had stopped being quite so lonely and was still adjusting to the change. Thank you, she said, for stopping. Thank you for standing still long enough to be stopped for, he said. From the kitchen, Sophie's voice rose above the general noise. Victoria, Elena says my essay introduction is strong, but you said the first sentence was trying too hard, and you can't both be right, so I need a tiebreaker. Victoria raised an eyebrow at Mason. You're the tiebreaker, he said. I'm always the tiebreaker, she said. That's because your opinion is the most inconvenient, he said, which means it's probably the most honest. She almost laughed, and then she went back to the kitchen, and he heard the three of them begin the familiar negotiation of Sophie's essay introduction, and Sophie's voice making her case with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and Elena's laugh at something Victoria said, and the particular noise of his kitchen with people in it who knew where things were kept. He stood at the doorway a moment longer. The curtains were on the windows. The light was on. Outside, the October city was dark and wet and ongoing, full of people driving home on highways in the rain, full of ordinary moments that were quietly extraordinary, full of chances taken and chances missed, and the long, patient work of becoming the person your life required you to be. He thought, the most important things rarely announce themselves. They show up as inconveniences, as a broken-down car on the shoulder of the highway in a storm, as a name spoken in a dark SUV that lands wrong in your chest, as a woman standing in the rain who turns to face you and for one disorienting moment looks like the part of your past you thought you'd buried, and you pull over or you don't. That's the whole thing, really. He had pulled over. He went back to the kitchen. Okay, he said, coming around the table to look at Sophie's notebook. Let me see this introduction. Sophie handed it over with the careful air of someone who has had enough editorial feedback and is now ready for a verdict. He read it. It was about their family, not the complicated backstory of it. She was 9 now, and 9 was old enough for the general shape of the truth, but not all its contours. And that was a conversation that would happen in stages over years, the way real things are revealed. But it was about the family she had now, the one that had assembled around her kitchen table by choices that nobody had fully planned. My family is not like most families, she had written, but I think most families are not like most families if you look closely enough. Mine has my dad, who is annoying about vegetables but good at everything else. And it has Victoria, who knows where the coffee is and is my sister, even though she is very old. And it has Elena, who makes good bread and sends me historical facts about whatever I am reading. My family started because my dad stopped to help someone in a rainstorm. I think that is a good way to start something. He set the notebook down. Sophie was watching him. Well, she said. He looked at her. He looked at Victoria across the table, who was reading the essay from the angle available to her, and whose expression was doing several things at once. He looked at Elena on the couch, who had looked up and was watching him with the quiet attention of someone waiting for a verdict they have a stake in. The first sentence is better than the second, he said. Ha, said Victoria, which was the most undignified thing he had heard her say in a year's acquaintance, and it made Sophie grin. I knew it, Sophie said. Elena made a noise from the couch that was part concession and part laughter. Mason pulled out his chair and sat down. The kitchen was warm and loud and imperfect and entirely real, and outside the October rain had started again, steady and soft, and none of them paid it any attention at all.